The Pentagon called them junk weapons. American inspectors literally laughed when they saw what the Australians had built in a rusty tin shed. Welded monstrosities, cut-down barrels, Frankenstein rifles assembled from the corpses of 3 different guns. But here's what nobody was laughing about: the body count. While American soldiers were dying because their brand-new M16s jammed in the mud, Australian SAS operators were racking up elimination ratios that the US military tried to bury for decades, 3 to 5 times higher than elite American units, with weapons that looked like they belonged in a scrapyard. How is that even possible? I'll tell you how. Because what happened in that workshop at Nui Dat wasn't just weapon modification. It was a complete rejection of everything the American military-industrial complex believed about warfare. And the results were so embarrassing that the Pentagon classified their own assessment report at the highest level. Today, we're ripping off that classified stamp. You're going to learn about the _1_ modification that horrified U.S. ordnance officers, about the Owen 16 hybrid that achieved 0 malfunctions on 37 consecutive combat missions, about ammunition hand-loaded with a technique so controversial that international lawyers still debate its legality, and the most disturbing secret of all, the _2_ supplies that Australian medics carried for situations too dark for official acknowledgement. This is the story that American military historians don't want you to hear. The story of how a handful of Australian bush mechanics humiliated the most powerful military machine on Earth. Stay until the end. Because what these men discovered in the jungles of Vietnam didn't just change the war, it changed special operations forever. Let's get into it. The American weapons inspectors stepped off the helicopter at Nui Dat in the scorching summer of 1967, carrying 3 leather briefcases filled with evaluation forms and a supreme confidence that would shatter within 72 hours. Colonel Marcus Webb had spent 14 years at the Pentagon's Small Arms Research Division, and he believed he had witnessed every possible modification to the standard infantry rifle. He was catastrophically wrong. What he discovered in the improvised workshops of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment would challenge everything the United States military establishment believed about weapons technology, field modification, and the fundamental nature of jungle warfare. The Australians were not simply adapting their equipment. They were rebuilding it from scratch, using techniques that American ordnance experts dismissed as primitive, dangerous, and borderline insane. But there was one uncomfortable fact that Colonel Webb could not escape. These scrap metal weapons were producing confirmed elimination ratios that exceeded anything American forces had achieved in the entire Vietnam theater. The story of Australian SAS weapon modifications represents one of the most suppressed chapters in special operations history. It reveals not just technical innovation, but a fundamental clash between 2 military philosophies. The Americans believed in standardization, mass production, and technological superiority through industrial might. The Australians believed something far more disturbing. They believed that the best weapon was the one that worked for the individual operator, even if building it required cannibalizing 3 other weapons and violating every ordnance regulation in existence. This is the story of how a handful of Australian bush mechanics revolutionized close-quarters jungle combat, while Pentagon experts laughed at their methods. The laughter stopped when the body counts arrived, but this was only the first shock. What Colonel Webb discovered next would haunt him for the rest of his career. The workshop at Nui Dat occupied a corrugated iron shed that had previously housed agricultural equipment during the French colonial period. The temperature inside regularly exceeded 45 degrees Celsius, and the smell of gun oil, solder, and human sweat created an atmosphere that most American visitors found unbearable. Sergeant First Class David Morrison, known to everyone as Bluey, had worked in this shed for 11 months, and his hands bore the scars of a man who had personally modified more than 300 weapons for Australian SAS patrols. Morrison had no formal gunsmithing training. Before enlisting, he had worked as a diesel mechanic in Broken Hill, New South Wales, fixing mining equipment in conditions that would have shut down any American factory. This background proved invaluable in Vietnam, where standard military weapons consistently failed in ways that the manufacturers had never anticipated. The M16 rifle represented the pinnacle of American firearms engineering when it arrived in Vietnam in 1965. It was lightweight, accurate, and capable of firing 800 rounds per minute on full automatic. It was also, in the brutal assessment of Australian operators, a weapon designed by engineers who had never spent a single night in tropical jungle. The problems were numerous and lethal. The M16's direct impingement gas system vented hot, dirty gases directly into the receiver, causing carbon buildup that jammed the weapon at the worst possible moments. The aluminium magazines corroded in jungle humidity. The small caliber 5.56mm round deflected unpredictably when it struck vegetation. And the rifle's tight tolerances, which made it so accurate on the firing range, transformed it into a mechanical liability when exposed to mud, sand, and the relentless moisture of the Vietnamese monsoon. American units reported jam rates approaching 30% during extended firefights. Australian SAS patrols reported something worse. They reported that they could not afford a single jam, because their six-man teams operated so deep in enemy territory that a malfunctioning weapon meant almost certain elimination. Morrison's solution began with what he called the dirty girl modification, a term that horrified visiting American ordnance officers. He deliberately loosened the tolerances on captured M16s, filing down bolt carriers and enlarging gas ports until the weapons would cycle reliably even when filled with debris. The accuracy suffered at ranges beyond 200 meters, but Australian SAS patrols rarely engaged at such distances. Their contacts were intimate affairs, conducted at ranges measured in single digits, where reliability mattered infinitely more than precision. Yet this was merely the beginning of Morrison's innovations. The modifications that truly shocked American observers were still waiting in the shadows of that sweltering shed. The Owen gun had been Australia's contribution to World War II small arms design, a submachine gun so ugly that British ordnance officers initially refused to evaluate it. The weapon looked like it had been assembled from plumbing supplies by a particularly aggressive handyman, which was essentially accurate. Evelyn Owen had built the original prototype in his backyard shed in Wollongong, using a combination of salvaged parts and pure Australian stubbornness. What the British critics missed was that the Owen gun worked. It worked in the mud of New Guinea, in the sand of North Africa, and in conditions that turned more sophisticated weapons into expensive paperweights. The secret was its top-mounted magazine, which used gravity to assist feeding rather than fighting against it. Dirt and debris simply fell out of the receiver, instead of accumulating inside it. By 1967, the Owen gun was officially obsolete, replaced by more modern designs that looked better in photographs, but performed worse in actual combat. Sergeant Morrison had acquired 17 Owen guns through channels that remained officially unspecified, and he had begun a modification program that the Pentagon would later classify as unauthorized weapons development. The Owen 16 hybrid combined the Owen gun's receiver and feeding system with the barrel and gas system of a modified M16. The result looked absolutely horrific, a welded monstrosity that violated every principle of elegant firearms design. It also functioned flawlessly, in conditions that reduced standard weapons to jam-prone liabilities. Australian SAS patrol leader, Corporal Terry McPherson, carried an Owen 16 on 37 consecutive missions between March 1967 and February 1968. He reported 0 malfunctions during that period, despite operating in terrain that American units considered impassable and weather conditions that exceeded monsoon intensity on multiple occasions. When American liaison officers requested to examine McPherson's weapon, Morrison initially refused. He understood that the Pentagon would never approve such modifications, and he feared that official attention would shut down the entire program. What changed his mind was a conversation with an American Green Beret sergeant who had lost 3 men during a single ambush when their M16s jammed simultaneously. The examination occurred on the afternoon of September 14, 1967, and the American report that resulted remains classified to this day. What leaked through unofficial channels suggested that Pentagon evaluators were simultaneously impressed by the weapon's reliability and horrified by its implications for American ordnance doctrine. But the Owen 16 was merely an appetizer. The main course of Australian innovation would prove far more controversial and infinitely more lethal. The cut-down modification represented perhaps the most controversial adaptation in the Australian arsenal. Standard infantry rifles measured over 1 meter in length, designed for engagement ranges that rarely occurred in triple canopy jungle. Australian SAS operators discovered that reducing barrel length by 30 to 40% transformed these weapons into close quarters instruments of devastating effectiveness. The physics were straightforward. Shorter barrels meant reduced muzzle velocity, which decreased effective range but actually increased terminal effect at close distances. The bullets exited the barrel before fully stabilizing, causing them to tumble upon impact rather than passing cleanly through soft tissue. The effect on human targets was substantially more severe than the clean wounds produced by standard-length barrels. American ordnance regulations explicitly prohibited such modifications, citing safety concerns and the potential for catastrophic barrel failure. Australian SAS operators ignored these regulations entirely, and Sergeant Morrison developed a heat treatment process that strengthened cut barrels beyond their original specifications. The Shorty SLR became the signature weapon of Australian SAS jungle operations. The standard L1A1 self-loading rifle, a 7.62mm battle rifle based on the Belgian FNFAL design, measured 1,143mm in its original configuration. Morrison's modification reduced this to 810mm, creating a weapon that could be maneuvered through dense vegetation without snagging while still delivering the heavy-caliber stopping power that 5.56mm weapons lacked. Warrant Officer Second Class Raymond Collins, known throughout the regiment as Tracker, carried a Shorty SLR on his legendary 63-day patrol through Phuoc, Thai Province, in late 1967. During that patrol, his 5-man team accounted for 23 confirmed enemy eliminations without suffering a single casualty. Collins later credited the modified weapon with saving his life on at least 4 separate occasions, noting that its compact dimensions allowed him to engage targets in spaces where a standard rifle would have been impossible to aim. The controversy surrounding these modifications reached its peak when an American CBS News crew filmed Australian SAS operators cleaning their weapons at Nui Dat in January 1968. The footage clearly showed modified firearms that violated every regulation in the American military inventory, and Pentagon officials demanded that Australian commanders address what they called dangerous non-standard equipment. The Australian response was characteristically direct. Lieutenant Colonel John Essex Clark, commanding officer of the Australian SAS squadron, reportedly told American liaison officers that his men would use whatever weapons kept them alive, and that anyone who objected was welcome to accompany them on patrol and demonstrate the superiority of standard equipment. No American officers accepted this invitation. And yet the most psychologically devastating weapons were still to come. What the Australians developed next would terrify not just the enemy, but their own allies as well. The shotgun modifications represented perhaps the most psychologically devastating weapons in the Australian arsenal. Standard military shotguns were designed for guard duty and close-quarters building clearance, roles that seemed irrelevant in jungle warfare. Australian SAS operators discovered that modified shotguns served a purpose that no rifle could match. They created fear. The jungle sweeper modification began with the Remington 870 pump-action shotgun, a reliable weapon that American forces used primarily for camp security. Morrison's team cut the barrel to the minimum legal length, then modified the magazine tube to accept 7 rounds instead of 4. They replaced the standard buckshot loads with hand-loaded ammunition containing a mixture of double-aught buck and steel fragments salvaged from destroyed vehicles. The effect at close range was catastrophic. Unlike rifle wounds, which could sometimes be survived with immediate medical attention, the jungle sweeper created injury patterns that exceeded the treatment capabilities of field medicine. Viet Cong units that encountered Australian shotgun-equipped patrols began reporting that the Australians possessed special weapons that caused wounds unlike anything in their experience. But the psychological effect proved even more significant than the physical damage. Prisoners captured by Australian forces reported that VC commanders had issued specific warnings about the Ma Rung, the jungle phantoms who carried thunderguns that could eliminate multiple men with a single discharge. The distinctive sound of a pump-action shotgun cycling became, in some areas, sufficient to cause enemy units to break contact rather than risk engagement. Corporal William Patterson, inevitably nicknamed Shotgun Billy by his mates, developed a technique that American observers found particularly disturbing. He loaded his modified Remington with alternating rounds of buckshot and solid rifled slugs, creating a firing pattern that combined area effect with precision penetration. During the battle for Long Tan support operations, Patterson allegedly used this technique to engage enemy machine gun positions at ranges exceeding 100 meters, distances at which shotguns were theoretically ineffective. The American after-action report on Patterson's performance noted that his methods exceeded doctrinal parameters and demonstrated capabilities not anticipated by weapons designers. This bureaucratic language concealed a simpler truth. The Americans had no explanation for how an Australian enlisted man with a hardware store shotgun was outperforming their carefully designed weapons systems. The Thunder guns had proven their worth, but Morrison's workshop held secrets far darker than modified shotguns. The suppressor program would change everything. The suppressor program represented the most classified aspect of Australian SAS weapon modifications, and details remained restricted for decades after the war's conclusion. What eventually emerged painted a picture of innovation that the Pentagon had desperately tried to ignore. Standard military suppressors in the 1960s were heavy, fragile, and degraded accuracy significantly. They were considered specialty equipment, useful only for specific elimination missions rather than general patrol operations. Australian SAS operators needed something different. They needed suppressors that could survive extended jungle patrols and function reliably for hundreds of rounds without maintenance. Sergeant Morrison's solution drew on an unlikely source. Before the war, he had worked briefly at a sheep station in Queensland that used suppressed rifles to cull kangaroos without disturbing the rest of the herd. The suppressors on these culling rifles were crude, heavy, and ugly. But they lasted for thousands of rounds because they used expansion chambers machined from solid steel rather than the delicate baffle systems found in military designs. Morrison adapted this agricultural technology to military applications, creating suppressors that weighed nearly twice as much as standard models but required virtually no maintenance. The additional weight was concentrated at the muzzle, which actually improved accuracy by dampening barrel harmonics during firing. The Whisper rifles equipped with these suppressors became the signature weapon of Australian SAS elimination missions. Patrol scouts would engage sentries in early warning positions without alerting main enemy formations, allowing the Australians to penetrate deep into hostile territory before contact was initiated. American MACV SOG teams operating in the same areas reported hearing ghost shots, suppressed weapon discharges that seemed to come from impossible positions. On at least 3 documented occasions, American and Australian patrols nearly engaged each other because the Americans did not recognize the sound of the modified weapons and assumed they were facing enemy forces. The effectiveness of the suppressor program was measured in uncomfortable statistics. Australian SAS patrols equipped with Whisper rifles achieved an average first contact advantage of 18 seconds longer than standard patrols. In close quarters jungle fighting, 18 seconds represented the difference between ambusher and ambushed. It represented the difference between survival and elimination. Silent weapons had transformed the jungle war. But the Australians were not finished innovating. Their next modification would violate international law in ways that lawyers still debate today. The ammunition modifications proved perhaps most controversial because they involved alterations to the rounds themselves rather than the weapons that fired them. International law, specifically the Hague Convention of 1899, prohibited the use of expanding or fragmenting ammunition in warfare. The Australians found creative interpretations of these restrictions. The jungle load modification did not technically create expanding ammunition. Instead, it involved hand-loading standard ball ammunition with reduced powder charges that dropped muzzle velocity below the threshold where bullets remained stable in flight. The result was ammunition that tumbled upon impact, creating wound channels far more severe than standard rounds, while remaining technically legal under international law. Sergeant Morrison's team produced approximately 12,000 rounds of jungle-load ammunition between 1967 and 1969. All of it hand-loaded in the Nui Dat workshop using equipment salvaged from a civilian ammunition factory in Saigon. The quality control was meticulous. Every round was individually inspected, and any ammunition that showed signs of inconsistency was destroyed rather than risked in the field. The effectiveness was undeniable. Patrol medical reports indicated that wounds inflicted by jungle-load ammunition required significantly less follow-up engagement than standard rounds. In the brutal calculus of small-unit jungle combat, this meant that Australian teams could move faster through contact zones because they spent less time ensuring enemy casualties were permanent. American intelligence officers eventually discovered the ammunition program through captured Viet Cong documents that described the special bullets used by Australian forces. The documents warned that wounds from these rounds were almost always unsurvivable without immediate evacuation, and they instructed VC units to disengage rather than risk prolonged contact with Australian patrols. The Pentagon response to this discovery remains classified, but unofficial sources suggest that American ordnance officers were simultaneously impressed by the tactical effectiveness and concerned about potential legal ramifications. No formal action was taken, possibly because prosecuting Australian allies for ammunition modifications would have exposed similar programs operating within American Special Operations units. The jungle loads had proven devastatingly effective, yet Morrison's innovations extended far beyond weapons and ammunition. What came next would revolutionize how special operations units communicated in hostile territory. The Bush telegraph communication modifications represented a different category of innovation, one that addressed the fundamental problem of coordinating patrols in terrain, where standard radio equipment consistently failed. American forces relied on the PRC-25 radio, a sophisticated piece of equipment that weighed approximately 10 kilograms and required careful maintenance to function reliably. In the jungle humidity of Vietnam, these radios failed at rates that commanders found unacceptable but seemed powerless to address. Australian signalers developed a series of modifications that American communications experts initially dismissed as impossible. They stripped the PRC-25 to its essential components, reducing weight by nearly 40% while actually improving reliability. They replaced the standard whip antenna with improvised wire antennas that could be strung through the jungle canopy, extending range beyond manufacturer specifications. And they developed a maintenance protocol using materials available in the field, including a cleaning solution made from locally sourced palm oil that proved more effective than the official military lubricants. Corporal Dennis Thornton, universally known as Sparks, became legendary among Australian SAS units for his ability to maintain communications under conditions that silenced American radios. On the infamous 53-day Bribby patrol, Thornton kept his modified radio operational through 3 complete monsoon cycles, river crossings that submerged the equipment for extended periods, and one incident where the radio was actually struck by enemy fire. The American communications officer who examined Thornton's equipment after the patrol reportedly stated that the radio should not have functioned at all based on its physical condition. The components were corroded, the circuits were contaminated with jungle debris, and the housing showed damage that would have required complete replacement under standard military procedures. Yet the radio worked, because Thornton understood his equipment in ways that exceeded formal technical training. This pattern repeated across Australian SAS modifications. Formal education consistently underestimated the capabilities of operators who had learned their skills through direct experience rather than institutional instruction. Communication problems had been solved, but the jungle held another enemy that no radio could defeat: the darkness itself. What the Australians developed to conquer the night would shock even their most experienced American counterparts. The night vision equipment modifications addressed one of the most significant tactical disadvantages faced by Allied forces in Vietnam. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army had learned to use darkness as their primary defensive weapon, launching attacks at night when American technological superiority was neutralized. Standard American night vision equipment in the 1960s was cumbersome, fragile, and provided such limited visibility that many operators preferred to fight without it. The Starlight scope, while revolutionary for its time, weighed over 2 kilograms, required batteries that lasted only hours, and produced an image so grainy that target identification remained difficult at ranges beyond 50 meters. Australian SAS operators developed modifications that improved on the American designs in several critical areas. They created improvised mounting systems that distributed the weight more evenly, reducing operator fatigue during extended night operations. They cannibalized multiple damaged scopes to create hybrid systems with improved light-gathering capabilities. And they developed training techniques that maximized the utility of the limited visibility the equipment provided. Lance Corporal Michael Dempsey earned his nickname Night Owl through methods that defied conventional military doctrine. He became the most successful night hunter in Australian SAS history, accounting for confirmed eliminations of 14 enemy personnel during nocturnal operations between 1967 and 1968. His technique involved using the modified night vision equipment in conjunction with traditional Aboriginal hunting methods, waiting motionless for extended periods until prey revealed itself through movement or sound. Dempsey's after-action reports described an approach to night combat that American units found almost incomprehensible, where U.S. forces used illumination rounds, flares, and massive firepower to compensate for darkness. Dempsey embraced the darkness as an ally. He moved through enemy territory with his modified scope, identifying targets through patience rather than technology, engaging only when he had achieved complete tactical surprise. The results were undeniable. Dempsey's patrol achieved a contact ratio of 47-1, meaning they eliminated 47 enemy combatants for every casualty suffered. This ratio exceeded anything achieved by American units in comparable operations, and it demonstrated that technological innovation combined with traditional fieldcraft could produce results that technology alone could never match. The night had been conquered, but the most legally controversial program was yet to be revealed. What Morrison's team created next would spark investigations that continue to this day. The booby trap modification program represented perhaps the most legally controversial aspect of Australian weapons development. International law contained specific provisions regarding mines and explosive devices, and many of the Australian modifications existed in grey areas that lawyers continue to debate. The jumping jack represented the signature Australian contribution to area denial weapons. Standard anti-personnel mines detonated at ground level, producing casualties primarily through fragmentation. The jumping jack used a small charge to propel the main explosive to approximately chest height before detonation, dramatically increasing the radius of lethal effect. The Australians did not invent the jumping jack concept. German forces had used similar weapons during World War II, and American designers had experimented with bouncing mines throughout the 1950s. What the Australians contributed was miniaturization. Their version could be carried by individual operators and emplaced without specialized equipment, transforming a crew-served weapon into a personal, defensive tool. Sergeant Morrison's workshop produced an estimated 400 jumping jacks during the war, each one hand-assembled from components salvaged from damaged American M18 Claymore mines and captured enemy ordnance. The quality was inconsistent, with an estimated 8% failure rate that Morrison considered acceptable given the improvised nature of production. The tactical effect was devastating. Australian SAS patrols began using jumping jacks to cover their withdrawal routes after contact, creating zones of denial that pursuing enemy forces learned to avoid. Viet Cong after-action reports captured in 1968 described the Australian mines as impossible weapons that attacked from the sky rather than the ground. American military police investigated the jumping jack program on at least 2 occasions, concerned about potential violations of weapons regulations. Both investigations concluded without formal action, possibly because the Australian modifications technically used only approved explosive components rearranged in novel configurations rather than truly prohibited weapons. The jumping jacks had proven their worth in combat. Yet Morrison's innovations were not limited to weapons of destruction. His team also modified the vehicles that carried Australian patrols deep into enemy territory, and these modifications would prove equally revolutionary. The vehicle modification program received less attention than small arms improvements, but its impact on Australian operational capability was equally significant. The long-range patrol vehicle, based on the Land Rover Series 2, underwent modifications that transformed it from a standard transport into a specialized combat platform. The changes began with the suspension, which Australian mechanics strengthened to carry significantly heavier loads than the manufacturer intended. They added reinforced mounting points for machine guns, creating firing positions that allowed 360-degree coverage without exposing operators to return fire. They installed improvised armor plating salvaged from destroyed aircraft, providing protection against small arms fire while maintaining the vehicle's off-road capability. The most significant modification involved the fuel system. Standard Land Rovers carried approximately 60 liters of fuel, sufficient for perhaps 300 kilometers of operation. Australian mechanics installed auxiliary tanks that tripled this capacity, enabling patrols to operate far beyond normal logistical range. They also converted several vehicles to run on captured enemy fuel, eliminating dependence on supply lines that Viet Cong units consistently targeted. The pink Panther variant became legendary among Australian SAS units, painted in distinctive pink camouflage that proved surprisingly effective in certain jungle conditions. These vehicles operated in areas that American command considered impassable. They carried enough supplies for extended independent operations and enough firepower to engage enemy forces significantly larger than their own. Warrant Officer Keith Patterson, known throughout the regiment as Wheels, commanded a Pink Panther patrol that achieved perhaps the longest continuous vehicle operation of the war, covering over 2,000 kilometers through enemy territory during a 43-day mission in 1968. His after-action report described conditions that would have immobilized standard vehicles within days. Mud, river crossings, jungle so dense that vegetation had to be cut away to allow passage. The modified Land Rover survived it all, returning to base with damage that mechanics described as unprecedented but repairable. The vehicles had proven capable of impossible journeys, but one final modification program remained secret for longer than any other. It addressed not weapons or vehicles, but the operators themselves. What Morrison's team developed for wounded soldiers would spark moral debates that have never been resolved. The medical modification program addressed a critical gap in special operations capability. Standard military medical kits were designed for conventional infantry operations, where casualties could be evacuated to field hospitals within hours. Australian SAS patrols operated so deep in enemy territory that evacuation might be impossible for days or even weeks. Corporal Jennifer Walsh, one of the few female personnel assigned to support Australian SAS operations and known throughout the unit simply as Doc, developed a modified medical kit that became standard issue for deep penetration patrols. The kit contained components not found in official supplies, including veterinary medications that proved effective for human treatment and improvised surgical tools designed for field conditions. Walsh's modifications reflected a fundamental understanding that special operations medicine required different solutions than conventional military health care. Her kits included antibiotics in concentrations higher than officially approved, painkillers strong enough to allow continued operation despite significant wounds, and coagulants that could stabilize injuries that would otherwise prove rapidly unsurvivable. The controversial element of Walsh's program involved what she called terminal care supplies. These were medications that could peacefully end the life of a severely wounded operator who could not be evacuated and whose survival was impossible. The existence of such supplies was never officially acknowledged, but multiple veterans have confirmed that they were carried on deep penetration missions, where the alternative to peaceful ending was capture, torture, and intelligence compromise. American military medicine officials were horrified when they learned of the terminal care program, and they demanded that Australian commanders end it immediately. The Australian response was characteristically pragmatic. They pointed out that American special operations units faced identical scenarios and had no better solution. They asked whether it was more humane to allow wounded operators to suffer prolonged agony while enemy forces closed in, or to provide them with a peaceful alternative. No satisfactory answer was ever provided. The medical program remained the most closely guarded secret of Australian SAS operations. But the cumulative effect of all these modifications had created something unprecedented in military history, and the Americans were about to discover just how far behind they had fallen. The cumulative effect of Australian modifications created a force multiplier that American analysts struggled to quantify. Individual innovations might seem minor, but their combination produced operational capabilities that exceeded the sum of their parts. A standard Australian SAS patrol in 1968 carried weapons that were individually unremarkable, but collectively represented thousands of hours of modification work. Each operator had equipment customized to his specific needs, maintained by personnel who understood that lives depended on reliability, and modified based on lessons learned through actual combat rather than theoretical testing. The Americans, by contrast, operated with standardized equipment that offered no allowance for individual adaptation. Their weapons were identical regardless of the operator's size, training, or mission profile. Their doctrine assumed that mass production would compensate for individual limitations, that the superiority of American industrial output would overwhelm any enemy regardless of tactical sophistication. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The statistics that emerged after the war told a story that the Pentagon attempted to suppress for decades. Australian SAS units operating with modified equipment achieved confirmation ratios that exceeded American special operations units by factors of 3 to 5. Their casualty rates were correspondingly lower, not because they avoided contact, but because their equipment functioned when it mattered most. The final American assessment of Australian modifications was completed in 1973 and immediately classified at the highest level. The portions that have since been released describe a systematic failure of American ordnance doctrine, a refusal to acknowledge that individual operators might understand their needs better than institutional designers. The assessment recommended that American forces adopt Australian modification practices for special operations units. This recommendation was rejected, reportedly because it would require acknowledging that Australian innovations had exceeded American capabilities. The Pentagon had buried the truth. But the legacy of those modifications would eventually reshape special operations forces around the world. The final chapter of this story was still being written. The legacy of Australian SAS modifications extends far beyond Vietnam. Many techniques developed in Sergeant Morrison's workshop eventually found their way into official military equipment, though the Australian origins were rarely acknowledged. The modern M4 carbine, standard issue for American Special Operations Forces, incorporates barrel lengths and tolerance specifications that mirror Morrison's modifications from 50 years earlier. The modular weapon systems used by contemporary elite units reflect the Australian philosophy that operators should customize their equipment rather than adapting to standardized designs. The suppressor technology developed in the Nui Dat workshop influenced commercial designs that now dominate the civilian and military markets. The improvised night vision modifications pioneered by Australian operators anticipated developments that would not reach mainstream military service for decades. Perhaps most significantly, the Australian approach to weapons modification influenced the entire culture of special operations equipment development. The modern Special Forces operator expects to customize his equipment, to modify standard issue gear for specific mission requirements, to treat manufacturer specifications as suggestions rather than limitations. This expectation originated with men like Sergeant Morrison, Corporal McPherson, and Warrant Officer Collins. They demonstrated that field experience could produce innovations that exceeded institutional research, that the operator who depended on equipment for survival understood its requirements better than the engineer who had never faced combat. The American weapons inspector, who arrived at Nui Dat in 1967, left as a changed man. Colonel Webb spent the remainder of his career advocating for modification programs within American special operations units, arguing that the Australian experience had demonstrated capabilities that the United States could not afford to ignore. His recommendations were consistently rejected by the Pentagon bureaucracy, which remained committed to standardization despite mounting evidence that standardization produced suboptimal results. The American military-industrial complex had too much invested in mass production to acknowledge that a handful of Australians working in a corrugated iron shed had solved problems that billion-dollar research programs had failed to address. The bodies continued to pile up, both enemy and American, while the bureaucrats debated whether improvised modifications could possibly equal engineered solutions. The Australians stopped caring about the debate long before it concluded. They had proven their point in the only arena that mattered. The jungle did not care about doctrine. It only cared about results, and the results spoke for themselves.